I would move now for one of the topics that brought us here, which is your new publication, which we have here.
Impressive. Let me show.
Yes, it is an impressive book. Quite a substantial, lack of a better word, a substantial research, of which this is the first volume. When are you planning to bring the other two into completion?
Well, hopefully during the next few years. By few, I hope to be able to finish each of the two remaining volumes within some 3 years each. That all depends, of course, on various circumstances. But basically, I have 3 projects, 3 larger projects to work on in these coming years. This is the biggest one, but the other 2 also have to do with astrology. So they take up some of my time and energy. Maybe it's worth mentioning them briefly because they cover the ancient world, while this project is about the early modern period. So the other 2 projects are an anthology of Greek astrological poetry that is under contract with Oxford UP. We started last fall. That means Claudio De Stefani in Italy, and he has only very limited experience in the history of astrology, but he is an expert for late Greek poetry. And so we think we are a good team together for such an anthology. And the 3rd project is one that I promised many years ago to David Pingree and his wife, namely to bring his edition of the very late Greek prose astrologer Rhetorius of Egypt to the press. He edited the text, but regrettably he passed away a bit before the publication of this volume, and it was postponed by various biographical circumstances in my CV for numerous years, but I much hope to bring that to publication sometime soon. It is under contract with De Gruyter because Rhetorius preserves many summaries of otherwise lost Greek astrologers of earlier centuries, like Thrasyllus, Balbillus, and many other texts. But those are the 2 ancient projects, and this one is the flagship, the big early modern project, which grew out of a far more modest project. Somehow I have a tendency towards exploding small projects into large ones, but it originated from an article in the early 2000s, which was a contribution to a conference in Wolfenbüttel in Germany about astrology in the Renaissance, divination in the Renaissance. And I realized very soon that the field of conjunction astrology was far too large to be covered in a small publication. And now this, eventually I limited the project to a specific time window, because my interest is basically in conjunction astrology in the late medieval and early modern period, because it is extremely under-researched in my opinion, despite the thousands of predictions that have been produced in that field and based on these Perso-Arabic astrological doctrine. But I realized that I have to limit my investigation on a time window chosen from those centuries from about 1300 to about 1700 CE. And I chose the time window which includes 2 conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter, the ones in 1484 and 1504, because those are the ones that received for the first time a large amount of handwritten but also printed predictions of the future. And there is very little research that has been published so far. To my amazement, there is not even a single text relevant to this field of conjunction astrology that has been edited and translated and commented on. As an example, if with the exception of one very early text edited and briefly commented on by David Pingree and Bernhard Goldstein on a prediction regarding the conjunction of 1345, but that is very early in the development, the prediction by Levi Ben Gerson, a Jewish scholar. So I am particularly interested in this time window from the 1480s to the early 15th century, and the first volume that you kindly brought into play in our conversation, that is entirely devoted to a single text. Initially, my plan was to write some 10 or 15 pages about John of Lübeck, but then I realized that I had barely scratched the surface of a much more complex and also intriguing story. To make a long story short, I was amazed by how many problems can be involved in a rather short text, which is maybe 10 or 15 printed pages long in the Latin original, but it took quite a long time and much effort to elucidate its content in a manner that is hopefully that will hopefully be useful, even if we know almost nothing about the life of this author. Mm-hmm. But this text is fascinating in my opinion, because it's unlike many other astrological texts of that time. There is a very sophisticated technique that he employs. One finds numerous other predictions based on the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter in those decades, which tend to treat the astronomical data in a rather superficial manner and mix the prediction with many religious and prophetic elements. But this text is almost entirely free of the historical religious material. Instead, it focuses in a very sober manner on technical aspects, and for a reader interested and knowledgeable in these astrological tenets, I think at least it must have been stunning to see how that horoscope that he analyzes of the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 1504 would allegedly bring about the eschatological event of the rise of the Antichrist.
Yeah. Yes, I am curious because the text I studied, the author I studied, he copied the prediction written by John of Ascendon for the conjunction of 1365.
Yes.
The first for some astrologers was the first in the cycle of water signs in Scorpio. Yes. But he disagrees, and he says that John of Ascendant was a great master, and everything is right except that what he said for this conjunction in Scorpio 1365 is true for the conjunction of 1425. So he skipped. Yes. Also in Scorpio, and it is all about the Antichrist and everything. So there was this discussion about which one is the first of the water sequence. I'm curious if this author mentions any of this or just skips into the 1506 conjunction without even worrying about the which one is the first, because he's right in the middle of the water sequence, so probably was not even worried about it.
He does not mention the beginning of the cycle within the watery zodiacal signs. So he goes straight into the analysis of his conjunction chart and the chart of the vernal equinox, but other authors of the same period, like for instance Paul of Middelburg, who wrote in 1484 for the conjunction of 1484, and who will be the most important author in my second volume, he goes into much more detail regarding previous conjunctions, and especially the beginning of what was for him the contemporary cycle within the watery signs. The problem for everyone writing in the late 15th century about or writing predictions of the future based on the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter was that those people in the late 15th century were living somewhere in the middle of their cycle, about 100 years after its beginning and about 100 years before its end. So it was difficult to announce any major new event in history, because they were dealing with so-called small conjunctions. Mm-hmm. But for instance, Paul of Middelburg argues in his prediction of the future that one detail of Abu Mashar's conjunction astrology must be applied, namely that the effects of a major conjunction which implies a shift of triplicity will not come about immediately, but with a delay of several Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions. And these delays are usually, that depends on the triplicity in which the conjunction occurred, the one with the shift. But in the case of the watery triplicity, Paul of Middelburg argues, the shift will be 6 conjunctions. So it will be about 120 years after the true shift. And that brings us back to your question with the year 1365. So if, according to the Alphonsine tables, the shift occurred, the shift towards the watery triplicity, if it occurred in the year 1365, then according to Abu Mashar, this is what Paul of Middelburg argues, then, according to Abu Mashar, the shift will be not the shift, the effects will come about 6 conjunctions later, namely in 1484, they will be released by the conjunction in 1484. And so maybe this theory of Abu Mashar has something to do with the discrepancy that you mentioned between the year 1425, or which one was it?
It was 1365 or 1425, because both occurred in Scorpio.
Yes.
And so this author that I studied, he was like, although respecting John of Ascendant and all these predictions, he was like shifting the predictions to the other conjunction in the same sign.
I don't recall correctly, but I think the problem was that the first conjunction, the earlier conjunction, it's mixed, so it's a triple conjunction in which you mixed
two elements.
Conjunctions in Libra with a conjunction in Scorpio,
I think
and
I think that's
if I recall correctly, that was the issue. So they're not sure if they should consider that first one, or if it is the next one that will really mark the entrance of the triplicity. And I think that's always a doubt that lingers. So probably that explains why the dates shift from one author to the other, depending on how they're considering the triplicity, the beginning of the triplicity.
Yes, admittedly, I would have to look up the astronomical details of that conjunction in 1365 to say, to make a reliable statement about that. But one thing that may also have played a role is the fact that after the conjunction of 1365 in Scorpio, we had 2 conjunctions shifting back into the airy triplicity, and it was only in 1425 that the cycle stayed permanently for more than 100 years in the watery signs. Yes.
Which can also bring again the same technical doubt.
Yes.
When does it begin exactly?
From what we have seen, the changes between air and water are the most irregular. For some astronomical reason, they are very irregular. The changes between other triplicities are more regular, are more easy to spot.
Just a jump, one conjunction.
For some reason, between air and water, they are really irregular. There are some kind of astronomical reason for this, I'm sure.
That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. Yeah, sounds interesting.
We can send you like a list of all the conjunctions.
Yes.
Because we can see that they are very irregular when it comes to these
calculated, at least with modern software, then of course, this needs to be compared with alpha sign tables or other tables, because they might not have exactly the same data as we have. And I've seen quite notable discrepancies in some of the dates and the conjunction degrees, of course. But this is, and I was also thinking that kind of dating is not the same, of course, but very similar to the dating they use on eclipses, in which they discuss the same kind of thing, which is the effects of the eclipse can appear months, years, sometimes after the eclipse has occurred, depending on the position relative to the horizon where the eclipse occurs. So I think probably we're seeing a similar methodology being applied here.
And there was also another parallel discussion, at least in the text I studied, that is whether to study only the conjunction or the lunation that preceded the conjunction.
Yes.
So mostly they use the lunation because it's easier to calculate. But some authors were like, no, the conjunction is more important. And then others said we should incorporate also. And even give some priority to the lunation that precedes the conjunction. So all this we can see in this text by the end of the 15th century, people experimenting with all these things and with different opinions.
Yes, that is in fact a field which I found particularly intriguing and which motivated me to extend that investigation towards a monographic and now even 3-volume project, because in in the case of that conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in 1504, one sees basically what you just mentioned. Some astrologers limit their prediction on the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. But it was preceded by a whole series of conjunctions by Saturn and Mars or Jupiter and Mars. And since the conjunction of Saturn and Mars was considered to be particularly negative and harmful, that if one takes that into account, one gets a different picture, of course. And then, so depending on how large the time window is that one takes into account, one gets different results. Of course, other factors also contribute to producing different results. And then one has the various eclipses and conjunctions, broadly speaking, between Sun and Moon that are taken into account by the majority of those who wrote about these phenomena. What I found also interesting is that predictions are not necessarily written before the conjunction, because since the effects of the conjunction can come about, according to this Arabic theory, within the next 20 years, you can write a prediction 10 years after the event, which is truly a prediction of the future. But such a prediction written years later, and we have such texts, such a late prediction will probably be influenced by the earlier predictions that have been published, like the one here by John of Lübeck. He wrote 30 years before the astronomical event. So what one sees is in my opinion, the creation of a discourse that develops over several decades. And even if not every participant in that discourse knows all the texts that have already been produced by others, they tend to know various enough of the other texts, because they have been published in print, in order to build on the already existing texts.
Yes, I've seen that also in my research, which is early modern, also more into the 17th century, in which you see them almost chain connecting the several events to try to understand how they should predict that specific, for example, comets. You see that in comets and eclipses, in which they do an historical contextualization of the various conjunctions, sometimes taking into account the degrees of magnitude of each of the events. So they can produce, well, taking into account what has happened so far with this conjunction, then probably this is signaling something else.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see, and of course that going back to see what other people were writing, so that they can work on that and do so. Yes. The quoting and the research on the predictions being made, which is quite interesting. To see that dynamics. Of course, in print, as you said, it's easier because things are more widely accessible. Yes. But for example, with Elena's work, we have evidence that you also have that in the manuscript edition, because if they have access to manuscripts, to some kind of library or repository of manuscripts, then they usually do this kind of citation as well.
Yes,
perhaps not so extensive.
I was taking a brief look at the conjunction of 1506, and I noticed it is in Cancer. So when Mars joins Saturn, this is, for the tradition, a very difficult conjunction, yes, because the two malefics were debilitated. So I suppose, I've never read these predictions for this year, but I suppose it was kind of very dreadful, a very dreadful prediction, because the two malefics, Mars and Saturn, were both conjunct in and in a very debilitated state. So I suppose it was really scary for them.
Yes. As a matter of fact, some authors concentrate even exclusively on the conjunction of Saturn and Mars in Cancer, which was in the year 1503, and then in 1504 we have in the spring the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, and the simple fact that there was one of these baleful negative conjunctions of Saturn and Mars in Cancer may also have contributed to the desire of some astrologers of that time to use astrology towards, how can I say that, there was this long medieval tradition of prophetic predictions of the future, including the end of the world and the Last Judgment. And it had been, as you know, with Roger Bacon especially in the 13th century, that Bacon suggested and invited astrologers or scholars, broadly speaking, to make use of this new science of astrology, or new in the sense that it had recently been imported from the Oriental world, to make use of that, not as a substitute of divine inspiration or religious prophecy, but as another contributing method of finding out the time of the end of the world. And there was a widespread expectation that the end was near, that the Antichrist would be born relatively soon. And the author that I wrote about, this John of Lübeck, seems to have exploited this, well, I would actually say this need of many people of the time to have that expectation of the near end of the world specified in a more to have someone come up with a year. When exactly will it be? It was clear that the end was relatively near. So if that is constantly on your mind, you need someone to tell you when exactly will it be.
Yes.
Will it be this year or 10 years from now? And in a way, I've been thinking a lot about one problem that is involved in this text, which may also be of interest to many other readers. It is pretty clear that John of Lübeck manipulated the data, but we do not know why. There is a whole list of arguments that shows that his conjunction horoscope, which is very fascinating, if it were true, astronomically speaking, then it would have an enormous impact. And I think many people have not noticed, or most people will not have noticed, that he secretly manipulated the horoscope a bit. I do not know why he manipulated the data, but I tend to think that this was partly because of the need in his and many contemporaries' thinking to rationalize and to make this to rationalize this expectation and to make it somehow mathematically treatable, or to gain some kind of mathematical access to talking about this upcoming event. As you see, I'm struggling with this problem. I'm still struggling with it because, in a way, it has taken me aback when I realized he is not entirely honest, which one would expect from an author. On the other hand, he may have had good reasons from his point of view, partly personal, because he dedicated his text to the Emperor Frederick III, probably hoping for protection and maybe for promotion of some kind. But maybe also in order, he says at the beginning of his text that he did this entire analysis because he had been asked by unnamed people if such techniques taken from the Arabs can be used to nail down the time of the end. Maybe he felt the need to doctor the data a bit in order to come up with a satisfactory event in the near future. But I would wish we had more biographical information about this man, but unfortunately this is the only text and the only information we have about him.
And it's not certainly a calculation error.
Almost certainly not. This is not one of the cases where one can speak of absolute clarity or absolute proof. There is a small margin of possibility that numerous problems came together, but the kind of evidence is pretty strong because he quotes several astrological texts, but he leaves out a few words in several quotations, and these words that he leaves out are always detrimental to his theory. Then he gives the impression through his data of being well versed in astronomical computation. But he gets the longitudes of Mars and Venus massively wrong by 2 entire signs, but in a manner that places Mars exactly together with Saturn and Jupiter. So for him, it is a triple conjunction, not only by Saturn and Jupiter. And there are a few more surprising irregularities of this kind. He even goes so far to quote from the Gospel of John in a manner that is simply wrong. He refers to the beast with the 10 heads in the Apocalypse of John, but it is so in the Apocalypse it is a beast having 10 horns. And he speaks of 12 horns. In the entire tradition, there is...
I think throughout the centuries, the beast has grown 2 extra.
Yeah, maybe, but this allows him to interpret the 12 horns as the 12 pseudo-apostles of the Antichrist. It is a very fascinating text, and he must have had access to a large library of astrological, magical, demonological and philosophical texts. He quotes from partly hard to find medieval texts, and I think he was working, he wrote this text in Padua in northern Italy, and he must have used the Padua library of the university there extensively in order to have access to all this material.
I'm just curious about one technical detail. You said that he displaced not only Mars, but also Venus. And as you know, Venus cannot be very far from the Sun.
Yes.
Does he take Venus more than 2 signs away from the Sun? That
No.
would be unforgivable.
Yes, you are absolutely right. No, he is clever enough not to make such a mistake, but he well, since you asked me about that, I'll give you a brief explanation of what he actually does. His main authority is not Abu Mashar, but Masha Allah. And because Masha Allah provides one tenet in his brief treatise on eclipses and conjunctions of the planets, Masha Allah says in chapter 9 that there is one special occasion which is also to be counted as a great conjunction, namely when the 3 superior planets come together in one decan, or more broadly speaking, within one sign, but preferably within one decan, within 10 degrees, plus one other planet. So the 3 superior ones, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, plus another planet. And Mars and Venus are too distant in the true horoscope of that conjunction. So he moves Mars by 2 entire signs to bring him into that decan, and Venus by 1 sign. Venus was, I think, Venus was close to her elongation, so pretty far removed from the Sun at that time, and he moves it within the astronomically possible spectrum in order to fulfill Masha Allah's conditions. And to add one more detail, as many of these astrologers of the time, he gives not only the horoscope of the conjunction, but also that of the preceding vernal equinox, which is, as you know, originally the more important one. And in order not, and he manipulates the position of Mars a bit in that previous horoscope too, in order to avoid people being surprised by the difference between the 2 horoscopes.
Clever.
Because everyone knows that Mars moves about 1 sign every 2 months. And so it would be impossible for Mars to move too many signs within a few months. I discussed these details in detail with a historian of astronomy who is also knowledgeable in the field of astrological texts, with Richard Kramer in Dartmouth. And in order to avoid fanciful interpretations on my side, but he was also convinced that some manipulation must have happened there. But the result, so in a way I was disappointed because I'm 99% convinced that he manipulated something. But the result is a piece of art. It's a horoscope that is rectified and a bit manipulated, with the result that all these traditional features of the life of Antichrist, because there had been a long tradition at which age he would make his first appearance in the public, how that his age would be 33, like that of Jesus, when he would be destroyed by God in the end, that he would be born from a Jewish mother in the Near East, etc. And so there was a whole tradition of, in quotation marks, biographical elements of Antichrist. And this horoscope that John of Lübeck presents us with allows in an admirable, really stunning manner to read these biographical details that were established by tradition, to read them out of the horoscope by employing traditional astrological techniques. It must have been amazing to those readers who were trained in astrology and convinced that the end was near.
Yes, it's very interesting because it becomes a good example of how belief, or at least the idea or what's in the astrologer's mind, will affect the way that the technique is used.
Or in this case, manipulated.
In this case, manipulated, of course. But it is interesting because I've seen examples later on, for example, here in Portugal, you have certain astrological texts that, despite being very accurate mathematically, the interpretation is shifted to accommodate, or it's given strange preponderance to certain factors, because they want the messianic ideal that that is appeals to them to be rectified and to be reiterated by that astronomical conjunction. So it's more or less the same mindset that we're talking about. Perhaps I haven't found the same kind of forgery or manipulation that in this example, but it's the same thing. So it's also an interesting thing to see belief affecting the technique, the more mathematical aspect of astrology. So it's quite
that's interesting. In which century? The
17th century.
Because just for context, we had a king that was very, very young, and he went to this North Africa to fight. He was 24 and really a child and not even a warrior, but he decided to go. And he went to Alcácer Quibir, which is a place in present-day Morocco, and he disappeared. So there are two things here: his birth chart, and when they calculate after, post factum, they calculate the longevity of this young man, and they said that he would live more than 24. So it's like a political factor, because when the king disappears with no children and no one else to replace him,
generates a complicated
the Spanish
succession.
would come, the Castilian would come and take the country, which actually happened.
Yes.
So there's a political context on this.
Exactly. At this point, we're already seeing the restoration of the Portuguese crown, and so you have a lot of expectation on establishing and the new king. So there's a lot of rhetoric with a lot of also messianic and religious factors coming into it. So the interpretation it's not manipulated exactly in the same manner that we're talking here, but it's biased. It's biased, exactly.
Biased.
And sometimes it's interesting. And in this specific text, I'm thinking, you see that he's perfect. He knows exactly that configuration does not say what he wants it to say, and it's much worse, much worse for Portugal than he wants it to be. You see certain vacillations in certain things he says that.
He's like trying to
make that bad for the Spanish and not bad for the Portuguese, but we clearly see that he's not completely sure about that, because it's obvious and it's quite interesting.
What we had is that the king disappeared by the end of the end of the 16th century, and then we had the Spanish here legally, I have to say, because the Spanish king, because they intermarried, the Spanish king was actually the next in line. But they were not resignated. They were not happy with this. So for 80 years, I think we had the Spanish. Well, the two countries. It was like double monarchy, two crowns, one king.
Yes.
And then they made this revolution, and the new king. So during these 80 years, we had a lot of messianic astrology, And in the 1640,
you have the restoration.
another king.
There's a coup, and
Yes.
a Portuguese heir is put into the throne.
And actually, one of the ways they have to legitimize this new heir is to say that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 1604, when he was born,
Yes.
is what they call horoscoping.
So he's rising
Is
in
rising
his
in
chart.
his nativity, and this is
Oh.
one of the arguments
Yes.
that he should be the new king.
Yes.
So
Well,
it was in Sagittarius. Yes.
That's very interesting, and I think that all is part of a broad picture which one finds in all these centuries. It is usually, in my experience with these texts, the authors are not interested in applying exactly the doctrine of an authority that lived many centuries ago without taking into account their own world in which they live.
Yes.
They do respect these authorities, but they know there are different authorities with partly contradictory tenets in various areas, and especially they live in a political, biographical, religious context.
Absolutely.
They have an agenda in which they practice astrology, and yes, and I think it is one of the most interesting aspects when one is lucky enough to find documents regarding a practicing and experienced astrologer of these past centuries that allow us to understand how he or she, how the person dealt with astrological doctrine, trying to accommodate the needs in a political or religious or whatsoever context. I would not be surprised, for instance, if John of Lübeck, the author that we were talking about in my case here, regrettably we have only this one text, but I would not be surprised if the reality was maybe that he tried to be a very conscientious astrologer in other fields, but that this text may have required a dose of let me call it manipulation, simply because he needed a patron who was willing to pay him a salary to keep him from poverty. I would not be surprised if there have been many astrologers who applied different levels of rigor or technical precision depending on the context in which, for instance, someone who is casting the horoscope of his own child will probably be more authentic and reliable and conscientious than someone who is trying to obtain a certain political result that is simply expected from him or needed in a certain situation.
Yes.
Actually, I read Dorian Greenbaum has a text about Kepler's letters to his master, and they exchange letters. And in one of the, I was surprised because Kepler describes his own son, Hendrik, in a way that is quite detached. And we have to keep in mind it's a newborn baby.
Yes.
And he's like describing not only the good parts, but also that he will be not a very good person and things like that in a very objective and scientific way for his own son.
Yes, interesting.
And then sadly the child dies. And then he really, we can see that he feels pain. He loved the child, but
Yes.
when it comes to describing the child astrologically, he's really,
Mhm.
he's merciless. He's really merciless. So it's very interesting.
Yeah,
He was very authentic in
Yes,
his own, with his own child.
It's interesting because it's where the technique meets the human being, and things start to change, either from the needs of the moment, the social needs, the political needs, the needs for patronage. We even have that, for example, with examples as Galileo or even Kepler, who emphasize certain aspects of the horoscopes of their patrons or expected patrons in order to accommodate a more colorful language, and they're not exactly manipulating, but they're emphasizing certain things to appeal to the patron. So that's interesting, and it's very human. It's the human side of the astrological practice, which is also
Interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And one finds numerous pieces of proof that even if such practices occurred, that does not necessarily mean that the practicing astrologer was less convinced of the truth of the art. I think they tended to adapt their practice to the different needs, depending on the context in which they were practicing. Yes.
Also, we have to keep in mind that when they are writing to a patron, they were not writing to a colleague, to another astrologer.
Yes.
Even though astrology was probably well known and people had at least a rudimentary knowledge, but he's not writing to another, as Kepler was writing to his master. But
yes,
when an astrologer is writing to his patron or expected to be patron, it's for someone who is not an astrologer. Mm-hmm. So they have to keep it simple and a bit pleasant, palatable. They have to make it pleasant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to avoid all too specific details that may be disproven soon by the development of events. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Careful also. Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let me just get back to to the book, and also I think it is clear why is it so long, and why suddenly what you said, what would be a few pages of research, exploded
yes.
into such a large book, which has 600, 700, almost around 700 pages, and you do treat with very detailed, let's say, the topics that surround the text, and this is what I thought was quite interesting. So you not only do a technical introduction to the techniques that are being used and to the context of this kind of prediction, which is quite interesting. You also then study the several implications, the religious narratives that are behind all of this, the reception of the text. You even go into demonology, so the argumentation.
It's a very complete study.
It's a very complete study. You do the astronomy, and you discuss the tempering in its own chapter. So it is quite a contextualization of a small text, even, which gives it all this richness and all this substance to the work, which I found very interesting. And also, I think it's an example of how a small text can, if analyzed properly and with all the detail, the required detail, can produce
such a
large volume and
such source of information.
Even the reception, which I think was very interesting, you're analyzing how the text is received and discussed with several authors as an example, is also interesting, so we can understand the impact of the text in its time.
This also emphasizes, let me just say something that is really important, it also emphasizes the importance of having these astrological texts studied and analyzed by people who actually understand the inner characteristics of the technique. Because you address also the context, but then you go also into the in-depth knowledge of what the person, what the author was saying. So it's very important for astrology to be studied by people who actually understand the context. Otherwise...
Yes. In this case, there was the additional problem that the text is written in quotation marks, bad Latin, strange, but that is a dangerous term to use. The Latin that was spoken in the universities was certainly, in many cases, not good Latin from the point of view of a classical philologist like me, but it was simply from everyday academic practice, the way they actually spoke. So in this text, the language itself constitutes a number of problems, and I tried to cover the whole range of problems, philological, of course, technical, and many other ones, as completely as possible. You mentioned the reception also, and yes, in a way, it ended in a similar manner to that article on the terms from which we started earlier, because my article on the terms has that outlook on on the medieval and early modern reception, passing through reviewing individuals like Pico della Mirandola and other ones. In this case, I found it, I like this attitude of searching a bit like a police detective who tries to hunt down the evidence and to create a profile of the person in question. And in this case, it was very interesting to see the impact of that the text had in the immediately following decades, not last because he wrote in 1474 about a conjunction in 1504, but the Antichrist would be born 2 years later in 1506, and he would appear in public and bring about the end of the world still 30 years later. So there was a rather long time span before the outcome of his prediction would be proven true or wrong. And in these decades, it was, for instance, fascinating to see in the Republic of Venice, which was close to where the text was written. It was written in Padua, but the second highest politician in Venice, Morosini was his name at the time, he came to learn about this prediction and was very concerned about the announcement that the end would now come about in the year 1540. And so this leading politician, who was inferior only to the Doge himself, took a gondola, went to the island of Murano, where a famous monastery is located, and where one monk, Orlandini, was known in Venice and the surrounding area for writing a massive book against all kinds of divination and especially against astrology. So this leading politician wanted to know what this expert on anti-astrological arguments thought about this prediction, and all the other monks in the monastery attended the learned exchange about the text. So these are insights in various social environments and also in various countries that we that are possible through the texts collected in this last section about the reception, which take us to the University of Krakow in Poland, but also to Dutch monks writing other texts in which this prediction has been received. Then in Italy, quite a number of authors have written about the text. It was only with the condemnation by the Catholic Church when it was put, it received the honor, so to speak, of being on the first list of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. And then for centuries, on every version of the index, this prediction was repeated. Because it was, basically because any prediction of the end of the world was prohibited by the Christian Church.
By the Church.
Yes, and such a use of astrology would be absolutely outside any rules of that the Church would allow. Yeah.
Yes.
Now it is interesting that the richness now of the impacts of these texts and how, as we were saying, how all these social movements, and you understand how astrology flows, and it's a knowledge that impacts quite strongly political decisions, personal beliefs, social movements, even a text which is small, although quite strong in the ideas that it carries.
Yes. So in this respect, we are not researching simply texts that have always been hidden in certain libraries without any impact on real life. In various extent, they have molded and contributed to the culture of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. Of course, not every text in the same degree, but since on the whole astrology had such a large impact, it is important to investigate it more deeply than in the previous decades in order to understand this contribution to what actually happened and to the late medieval and early modern culture more properly.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, I think we have been on a very interesting and long conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. I think it was a very interesting and rich exchange, and we'll be looking forward for the next volumes and also for your other lines of research very anxiously.
Yes, like this, attentively looking.
Yes, many thanks, Helena and Louis. It was wonderful to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much.
And we hope to see you again in the podcast for more of these discussions.
Yes, you are invited to more podcasts in the future.
Yes, I'll be glad to join you on other occasions too.
Thank you.
Thank you.